Gote and his wife. He ultimately gave custody to the wife. Well, then later, around 8 p.m., as Judge Wilkinson was coming home, he was shot and killed right here in this driveway. He was killed while his wife and son were actually inside the home at the time. And police believe that specifically because of his ruling in that custody battle, that he was killed. Now, this whole community here, they really have been shocked and shaken by this incident. Take a listen to what the sheriff had to say about all of this on Friday.
We're we're a small community here, close knit. So we pull together when something like this happens. So it was a concerted effort last night. We had more resources than we needed, but that's always a good thing.
Now, Victor Amra, law enforcement said they're sparing no resource when it comes to finding this judge's killer. They say that Pedro Argote might have been driving a silver Mercedes. They're using federal, state, and local law enforcement to try and track him down. They say at this point he's considered armed and dangerous. Victor Amra.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you for joining us this morning. We'll be back in about an hour.
Newsroom starts at 10 a.m. Eastern with the latest from the Middle East. Summer Kaddish is up next.
The new CNN Prime Time is where the truth shines. The day's big...
This morning in London, thousands are participating in this pro-Palestinian demonstration urged on by Hamas leaders. This follows similar demonstrations Friday in which angry anti-Israel protesters took to the streets around the world, burning Israeli flags and portraits of President Biden, even an effigy of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. They assembled outside many U.S. embassies, including those in Indonesia and Malaysia, also on the streets of Amman, Cairo, Paris, and Islamabad, everywhere from South Korea to South Africa. Meanwhile, the Rafah crossing into Egypt was briefly opened this morning to allow the first convoy of aid trucks to enter the besieged Gaza Strip. For the latest, I'm joined by CNN's Clarissa Ward in Cairo. Clarissa, when all was said and done, what was actually on those trucks and what is needed but was not provided?
So, Michael, on those 20 trucks, you basically had food, water, medicine. All those things desperately needed, but one thing that wasn't on those trucks was fuel. The Israelis have had serious reservations about allowing fuel to go in. They're worried it could be diverted by Hamas, but the UN is really concerned that fuel supplies are now down to maybe 2 or 3 days, and that fuel is so desperately needed to power generators, which are the only things that are allowing these hospitals to continue to function to the extent that they are still able to function. Also important to note, 20 trucks is nothing in the grand scheme of things. Before this latest spasm of violence, you would have 455 trucks a day, according to the UN, of aid going into Gaza. Now you've had 2 weeks, relentless bombardment, no aid, mass displacement, humanitarian catastrophe. So 20 trucks, the WFP is saying, could maybe meet the needs of 30,000 people in terms of food, and they need to reach about 900,000. That's why you're hearing full-throated calls from the UN, other humanitarian organizations saying this needs to be a sustained, continuous humanitarian corridor and not a one-off, Michael.
Clarissa, big picture, among the reasons for Rafah being such a choke point is that at this stage, it's the only perimeter of Gaza not sealed by Israel. True?
That's right. The Rafah border crossing is controlled by the Egyptian side, and the Egyptians have said they also don't want to have a massive outpouring of potentially hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into the Sinai Peninsula, which is where that border crossing is. Egypt has been fighting an insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula for many years now. Egypt already has huge social problems, poverty, and so you've heard Egypt's president say, listen, the answer to this is not us taking 1 million refugees that we simply can't care for. The answer to this is agreeing upon a sustained, continuous humanitarian corridor, establishing humanitarian zones inside of southern Gaza. We heard Secretary of State Antony Blinken talk about that too. But the issue is getting all sides to come together and agree on the conditions that would allow for that. And in the meantime, Michael, of course, it sounds like a cliche, but it could not be more true. Every day, every hour is so crucial for the people inside of Gaza who are not only facing relentless bombardment, but what the UN is calling an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding.
Clarissa Ward, thank you so much. Now, today at that Summit for Peace in Cairo, Jordan's King Abdullah called for a, quote, immediate end to the war on Gaza and a lasting resolution on the basis of the two-state solution. Joining me now is CNN's Nada Bashir, who is in Amman. Nada, thank you for being here. Amman has been one of the many scenes of an anti-Israel, anti-West protest. It occurs to me that we're only 2 weeks removed from the Hamas attack on Israel. That Israel was the subject of such cruelty seems to have earned it no sympathy with any of those pro-Palestinian protesters. Why?
Well, look, I do think that is an unfair way to characterize what we are seeing happening in Jordan and in much of the Middle East. When we speak to protesters on the ground, the vast majority of them tell us this is not about Hamas. This is not about expressing any indifference to the attacks against Israeli civilians on October 7th. In fact, for the vast majority of the people we've been speaking to here in Jordan, and indeed people that we've been speaking to across the region, this is about a conflict, an issue, a crisis which began long before October 7th. These are pro-Palestinian protesters. They are demonstrating against Israel's airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, which, as we know, have had a devastating humanitarian toll, a devastating human toll, that death toll rising, as Clarissa mentioned, by the day, by the hour. And of course, for many here, this is a call for an end to the siege on Gaza, an end to the blockade. As I said, for many, this began long before October 7th. This is about more than just what we're seeing happening now in Gaza. This is about the violence that we're seeing in the West Bank. This is about the expansion of settlements which are considered by many in the international community to be illegal under international law. This is a crisis, an issue, a cause which is central to many here in Jordan, where more than half of the population are either Palestinian or of Palestinian descent, and that is felt and reflected across the Middle East. Now look, you mentioned King Abdullah of Jordan there condemning the violence that we are seeing, and I think something that he said today at the Cairo Peace Summit really characterizes and captures what many people on the streets of Amman and across the Middle East are feeling. Let me just read you a bit of what he had to say. He said, "The relentless bombing campaign underway in Gaza as we speak is cruel and unconscionable on every level. It is collective punishment of a besieged and helpless people. It is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. It is a war crime. Anywhere else attacking civilian infrastructure and deliberately starving an entire population of food, water, electricity and basic necessities would be condemned." This is the message from King Abdullah of Jordan. This is the message that we have been hearing across the Middle East. This is the rallying cry that we have been hearing from protesters here in Amman. And as you well know, this is the message that we have been hearing from international rights groups, aid groups, NGOs on the ground who are trying to alleviate what Clarissa just mentioned is an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip.
I certainly understand that. I guess my point was to say that notwithstanding the history and complexity of the issue, to see tens of thousands of people rallying as they are just does not seem to recognize the suffering that only 2 weeks ago the Israelis endured.
Again, I don't think this is an expression of indifference to those attacks. That is certainly not the message we've been hearing from protesters that we've been speaking to. The focus of these protests is on the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe that is happening in Gaza. The focus, when you hear the chants, when you speak to people on the ground here in Amman and across the Middle East, is about what we are seeing happening in Gaza. And as you know, Gaza has been under a blockade since 2007. People cannot leave. We heard that evacuation order from the IDF telling people to move from the north to southern Gaza, where airstrikes have continued. And of course, as we've heard from many on the ground, including many medical staff that we've spoken to on the ground, they aren't able to evacuate most of the majority of those living in the north, or rather at least some of those living in the north. We're talking about the elderly, children, some in hospital who simply cannot leave. Doctors from Doctors Without Borders have told us that they refuse to evacuate because they cannot evacuate hundreds of patients, and they will remain in place in northern Gaza to provide care for them. This is a humanitarian catastrophe, and as we know, this is a densely populated area. It's about just over twice the size of Washington, D.C., hugely crammed with civilians. And when we see these airstrikes happening, we know the IDF says it is targeting Hamas positions, Hamas targets, but these civilian death toll that we are seeing that is rising is, in some ways, according to rights groups, inevitable because of how densely populated this area is. And we've seen that in the mounting death toll. We've seen that in the mounting death toll of children.
Nada Bashir, thank you so much for that report. Now, if things are already at this fever pitch, how can Israel and America hope to fight back against the terrorists without international condemnation? Before Israel has even launched its threatened ground invasion, is it facing a daunting public relations battle made worse by widespread online misinformation about the Israel-Hamas conflict? Joining me now is Morgan Ortagus. She was spokesperson for the U.S. State Department under Secretary Mike Pompeo, where she was responsible for messaging on sensitive and high-profile foreign policy actions, from hostage negotiation to foreign malign influence campaigns. Morgan, how can Israel, how can the U.S. reduce this global temperature?
Well, it's certainly a David and Goliath battle. So you have Hamas using a lot of online social media platforms and also Telegram to get their message out. Israel is taking a little bit of a different approach. They know that they're not going to be able to convince most of the Arab street. That's almost somewhat impossible. So they've really focused their efforts since October 7th on Twitter. And that's where you find a lot of Western journalists, a lot of government officials in the West, which makes sense for it's more where their audience is. You know, Michael, the only thing that they could do really is to look at this from a rapid response communications perspective. So what does that mean? That means that Israel and the United States have to be immediately transparent whenever there is some sort of action, good, bad, indifferent, and make sure that they're getting it out via social media, via things like online briefings to journalists. Israel is starting to, but should continue to up the amount of briefings that they're giving to international media so that they can get their story out. Of course, they're always going to face things like what we saw with the hospital attack, which was, unfortunately, trusted Western media sources believed Hamas, including, by the way, the United Nations, including members of Congress. They irresponsibly went out with the condemnations from Hamas without having the facts on the ground. So that's going to be Israel's challenge. If you've got trusted Western media outlets, if you've got the United Nations, if you have members of the American Congress promoting disinformation before the facts are out, then what happened? That got the Arab street riled up. That got people protesting at both Israeli and U.S.
Morgan,
embassies.
if I can make this point, if this is the climate today, just 2 weeks removed from the events of 10/7, imagine the global picture if the ground incursion is to come. I want to put something on the screen, and I'll read it aloud. Tom Friedman, as usual, in the New York Times, has a most provocative must-read column. I pulled just one paragraph out. He said this: if people cannot talk openly and honestly about a misfired rocket, imagine what will happen when the first major Israeli invasion of Gaza begins in our wired world, linked by social networks and polluted with misinformation, amplified by artificial intelligence. By the way, to be fair to Tom Friedman, he is advocating that an incursion in Gaza be paired with a sort of an allegiance, a pledge made by Israel to a two-state solution. That's the thesis of his piece. But on the point that he just made that I read aloud, what's your thought?
Well, Tom is exactly right. In fact, he had a column a few months ago about what the Biden administration should do when they were actively pursuing the Saudi and Israel peace initiative. And Friedman had pointed out in that column just how successful Hamas and other groups have been at getting young people riled up through Telegram, through digital games, through online games, and also through things like TikTok and other measures. We also saw this, by the way, it's not an insurmountable challenge. We understand the challenge. Don't forget, in around 2015, ISIS were producing incredibly slick videos on social media, online. They were, advertising the caliphate, what a wonderful thing it was to come to the caliphate in Iraq and Syria. They were convincing, young women in Britain and in the West to go be ISIS brides through their slick propaganda. So this is not something that is new. This is something that, we have dealt with. I mean, basically, if you go back to the Arab Spring, if you go back to Egypt and to Tunisia, Most of the Arab Spring started via Twitter. So, we've got a good 12 years here, 12, 13 years of having dealt with the Arab Spring, been dealing with ISIS propaganda and what you're seeing today from Hamas.
Thank you, Morgan.
It is a massive challenge.
Morgan, thank you very much. Appreciate your expertise.
Thanks, Michael.
What are your thoughts? Hit me up on social media. I'll read some responses throughout the course of the program. Catherine, what do we have? I think there is no good information during wartime. Each side always promotes information allowing their audience to infer that their action is right. Alice, I get your point, but I also think that in certain circumstances the facts don't matter. I mean, relative to the strike on the Gaza hospital, initially it seemed that Hamas was able to make great PR value of that, notwithstanding that Israel has released intelligence, the United States has released intelligence. Today there's a pretty good Associated Press analysis, all saying the same thing, that the rocket didn't come from Israel. The tens of thousands of people who are now coming out in protest around the globe seem undeterred by that evidentiary presentation. Now for today's poll question. Here's what I'm asking. Should Israel initiate a ground action in Gaza? Interestingly,
Thank you, Morgan.
President Biden a similar question last night.
Thank you, Morgan.
Air Force One. Here's what happened.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Morgan.
The White House quickly sought to clarify his comment, claiming the president misheard the question. An official told CNN that the president, quote, asked some hard questions about
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Morgan.
They're thinking, they're planning. So now I want to know what you think.
Thank you, Morgan.
Right now and answer today's question.
Morgan, you came from such a wonderful place, yeah.
We are 2 weeks into the Israel
About truth and misinformation.
What's the ultimate end game? What's the objective?
Morgan, thank you, girl. Wonderful that he interviewed you. Wonderful what you said. Thank you, girl. Thank you. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, girl. I want to honor what you said.
Plus, since the war began, the Republican presidential hopefuls, they've been trying to one-up one another about who supports Israel more. When and why did this issue become such a key GOP litmus test? And what might it mean for the 2024 election?
Stanley Steamer is proud to clean over 1 million homes across America every year.